Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Valerie Cronin-Fisher from Governors State University. We're going to discuss traumatic births. Welcome today.
Thanks.
Dr. Fisher teaches interpersonal and family communication, research methods, communication theory, conflict management. The goal of her research is to produce practical applications for use in everyday communication. She earned her master's and her Ph.D. from the University of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. As I said, today we're going to discuss traumatic birth, the experiences, the practices, and social conditions that lead to racial disparities in the birth process. I think the best way to start is, what is traumatic birth?
So traumatic birth is either the perceived threat or actual threat of injury and death. So just being afraid that something bad is going to happen, or actually having something bad done to you. But it's not necessarily, it's definitely a perception, not necessarily like what a doctor would say is traumatic. And oftentimes it's overlooked, the experience of women in the birth process, that it's like as long as they're physically okay, then we just keep on moving forward without thinking about the impact that has on women's emotional outcomes and relationship outcomes.
So it's a perception that there's a danger to my child, or there's a danger to me, or something's happening in this process that
that I'm not safe.
Yes, there's a fear and a stress, anxiety. Okay, so that's the whole concept behind birth trauma.
Yeah.
It's not so much that there's going to be a bad outcome, but in the process you're traumatized by the process itself.
Yeah, or there might be things along the way that didn't go, like you were not listened to, not respected, or you feel like your needs weren't being met in the process, and that makes a mother not feel safe, or she fears for her baby.
So one of the things that's interesting to me and most of our viewers is, how did you end up doing the research here? Why did this topic become part of your research?
Well, just a little bit about me in general. I'm not really one for small talk, and never really have been. And so I've always, when studying communication, I just want to get in there, like, tell me everything, your dirty secrets, your childhood traumas. I just want to know everything. But then in 2015, I gave birth to my first son and had an extremely traumatic experience without, even though I had prepared a lot. And so I had a really difficult birth. And then my transition to motherhood was very challenging as well. And I teach family communication. I'm a relationshipy person. I take care of my family members, gleefully. But then when it came time to take care of my own son, it was really, really challenging. And I felt like the rug had been pulled out from under me.
I know how to do this.
Yeah, and I felt like, hey, everyone said this is going to be the best thing to ever happen to me. And my birth and my transition to motherhood was really hard. And so I wanted to dive in. After about a year, of new parenthood, I thought I was ready, along with one of my professors at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Her and I worked on some research looking at the transition to motherhood and dissatisfaction with that, and then how having a traumatic birth influences that.
So that was what your dissertation was about then? It became based on your life experience and your understanding of communication and relationship.
Yeah, me-search, if you will.
Okay,
Yeah.
Okay. So I had a brief look at your dissertation, and it said there was a group of 60 women that were a part of the study. And at the end, you realized that there were only 3 women that were black, and they had different stories and experiences, dramatically different stories and experiences than the women that were white. So where does that lead you? You find this out. It may not be the primary goal, but you find this out, you discover it in the process. So what's the next step? Where did you go from there?
Yeah, so I, just to back up a little bit, so for my dissertation, I used a popular podcast. It's actually one of the most popular podcasts that pregnant and new mothers listen to, and it's called The Birth Hour, and it's really used for women to listen to gain information and to also find connection in similar stories. And so we just know in general in communication and relationships that it's like storytelling is a huge part of building our identity and building relationships. And so I thought this would be a great place to look for data because these stories, again, are being shared for an audience of similar people. So.
And there was no problem with you using the podcasts? I mean, did you have to get permission from each of the mothers, I guess, that were telling their stories, or were you just was that podcast just available?
Yeah, the podcast is publicly shared data, but I did reach out to the host, and we have a pretty strong rapport and relationship, and I've talked with her about both of the projects that I've worked on using her podcast, and she is an excellent interviewer too. Not a lot of leading questions or anything like that. So it was a great place to get these stories. And so from my dissertation research, again, we found that this idea of intensive motherhood and intensive mothering, so Hayes from 1996 sort of coined this idea that to be a mother is the highest honor and that it should be natural and easy, and a mother should always put her needs above or put her child's needs above her own. And it's sort of this like mother goddess, like I am one. And the findings from my dissertation found that these women, especially after experiencing a traumatic birth, they were like, this is not me. I can't do this all on my own. I can't be this intensive mother. And they really struggled with this idea of who they were as individuals versus who they were as mothers while also coping with birth trauma.
And what they're supposed to be as mothers.
Yeah, and what it means to be a good mother.
Yeah, because there has to be, I mean, there's women's magazines, there's mothering magazines, parent magazines, and there's this whole perception of what it means.
Yeah.
You'll be a good mother.
Yeah, and we have these two sort of competing discourses about motherhood. So number one, like one area is like you need to rely on your doctors, you need to look at the research, you need to do all these things, but then that's in sort of competition with like breastfeeding and natural motherhood.
Yeah.
It should be something that just happens and you don't have to think about it. Go with your mother's intuition. And then so mothers are stuck thinking like, oh my gosh, like this is a lot to deal with. I'm not sure how to navigate it. But one thing that I noticed in the findings was that for 3 of the 60 women, so I didn't code for race in this particular, in my dissertation, just looking at the stories, but I did notice that the 3 women that mentioned their race and they identified as Black really spoke to the idea that this institutionalized racism and how they were treated during birth was a huge reason why their birth was traumatic, that they felt like if they were not Black, they wouldn't have had that experience. And so finding that from my dissertation in 2018, I just was thinking about it and worrying about it and thinking like, well, what can I do about this? I need to dive deeper.
That's pretty effective. You went from 2015 when you had your child, and 3 years later your dissertation is done. So.
Yeah. Well, you know, I wanted to get a job.
Maybe not intensive motherhood, maybe intensive researcher.
Yeah, or both. You know,
Yeah,
I feel the weight of that too.
So let's explore this a little more, because you said that 3 of them self-identified as Black, which suddenly alerts you to this disparity between the experience that Black women may have in the birth process. Was it clear that they had white doctors and they had white nurses and they were in a predominantly white institutional setting?
Yes, in my dissertation research, yes, that was the case. But then switching gears into this most recent project, also looking at women of color solely, the ways that they gave birth and sort of this village that they built around themselves was super empowering and really great. So I'm excited to talk more about that today too.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about the findings, because I've read elsewhere, in addition to your work, that Black women experienced traumatic births or unexpected stressful situations 3 times or more as white women, and if you're over 30, it was even more. I think you said 4 to 6 times as often. They had this unpleasant experience. So what do you make of these findings? Because one way of saying is, well, that's because you're black, and that's why, you know, it's part of your culture, it's part of your background, and that's why you had this condition. But
yeah, and that's not it at all, right? Like that is I think one of the most important things to take away from this research, again, is that it's not race that leads to poorer outcomes. It's not like because you have certain characteristics that you're more likely.
that you have some genetic or
genetic
inherent
difference or anything
yeah.
like that. It's absolutely not that. But yeah, black women are 3 times at least more likely to die during childbirth or due to childbirth complications in comparison to their white counterparts. But it's not, again, any genetic features or anything like that, but it's racism. You know, it's not race, it's racism that is leading to these negative outcomes. And in recent years, really even since I finished my dissertation, just in general, there's been more talk and discourse around this, doing a lot more research in this area. And so like even celebrities like Beyonce and Serena Williams, really well-known women, have shared their experiences with birth trauma. And I think it's gained a lot more traction, and because of that, and it's getting a little bit more visibility, the women on the podcast that I have done the second study on have some really great feedback and takeaways for how you can sort of combat this issue.
So the second study, which is also based upon, what was it?
The Birth Hour.
Birth Hour podcast. Were you able to identify the race before you heard the stories or made sense of the stories?
Well, since my dissertation in 2018, the podcast has a new sub area where you can sort of filter the episodes, and so they now have an area that's BIPOC, so Black and Indigenous women of color, and so me and 2 of my research assistants at Governor State, so Bridget Cundy and Isabella Reyes, I want to make sure that I include them because they helped me significantly with this project. But we coded all of the interviews from the beginning of COVID-19 until present under that BIPOC heading. And so that was sort of the focus of our second study.
Okay. One of the things that I read in one of the writings, there's been a couple writings and you had some conference presentations, but you suggested rejecting a system that does not serve women. I'd like you to explain that a bit. What does it mean to reject the system? Are you talking about the healthcare system?
Yes, or at least not accepting the fate of the healthcare system. So in my dissertation data, I found that women generally felt really limited by this sort of intensive motherhood, that they could never live up to that. But in this particular study, looking at women of color, particularly Black women, we found that women rejected sort of this system by embodying this intensive mother. So I don't know if that makes sense, so I'll explain a bit more. But so rejecting the system of healthcare, so because they know, Black women especially know that when they go into a hospital setting that they have the cards stacked against them. Many of the women in these stories explained that like they were not going to give birth in a hospital. Instead, they chose home birth, and that wasn't necessarily only due to COVID-19, but because they didn't feel like they were safe. And they chose to only work with providers or midwives that were people of color. They hired emotional support people known as doulas so they can advocate and translate medical information. They also were people of color, and they had a support person, whether it be a partner or a close friend, family member, that it's like we need to sort of rally the troops in order to protect me and the baby. And so sort of rejecting the idea that, well, my fate is sealed, or, there's not much I could do. And so it's pretty amazing.
Infant mortalities after birth are much higher in this country than most countries in the world. I mean, they're lower in Cuba. The infant mortality in Cuba is lower than in the United States. So it seems like it's a questioning of the entire healthcare system that depends upon what job you have, what kind of healthcare you're going to get, or where you happen to live, and where providers happen to be? Or is it nearby? Are they qualified, or is it almost like a drive-by shooting, right? Drive-by birth or something. Mm-hmm. So my question is, how much of this is not to question that there's some racial bias and some racism in the structural system, but how much is that separate from the healthcare system and its inadequacy, or how much of that does that contribute to the effect of an inadequate healthcare system? Kind of putting it on, well, what's the opposite of steroids, right?
Yeah.
This gets stronger, but because it's already a bad healthcare system, then you add to that the racial bias that many healthcare providers would have because they live in a culture that we live in. Mm-hmm. So how would we separate those two out?
Well, just in general, when we look at birth overall in America, as you mentioned, women in general, across the table, white or otherwise, are way more likely to have complications, C-section rates, and infant mortality. Again, we're the worst in all of the developed countries, like by a long shot. Yeah. And so I think we can see there that sort of just sets the tone for birth in America. But then when we learn that Black women are 3 times more likely, we can see, that it's even more so for them, and that there's another layer where they're not being listened to or heard, or when they are noticing something's wrong, if their blood pressure is too high or they're in a significant amount of pain, they're just not getting their needs met, and then having to pay the price because of that.
I also think about many people's experiences with their doctors. There's an intensive expectation of patients to accept the word of the doctor. Mm-hmm. So the doctor prescribes a medicine and you come back in a month and say it's not working. The doctor will often say, well, just give it more time, and not hearing what you're saying. So there's also a cultural expectation that these experts know more about your body or your condition than the average person does.
Yeah, absolutely. And we sort of don't accept, we call it like bodily knowledge. And so again, we sort of lean on this biomedical, that it's like, well, doctor knows best and things like that. And so I think you're totally right that does really get in the way but it's a tall order too for doctors, right? To be meeting the emotional needs of each patient. And so it's a lot. And so it's an ongoing.
Yeah, I know. I've had kids, and I know the first time, my first son, we would go see the pediatrician, and he would, talk to you, play with Kendall, and the whole thing. But then his practice got bought up by a larger healthcare system, and when we went with my second son, it's like 15 minutes and we're out. And he apologized to us, but he says, we've only allowed, according to this system, we can't spend more than 15 times with you unless we find some major problem, and then we can have additional work, and so again, it's part of a structure it seems to be partly social class, where you are put into this condition where you have to use the healthcare system as it exists, but that healthcare system as it exists isn't always satisfactory. Mm-hmm. And it's even less so when we're talking about Black or Native or Latina women. So
absolutely.
Yeah. One of the things you said, and I thought you might explain this a bit, was you said Black and Indigenous women are embodied in intensive motherhood. You explained intensive motherhood, I get that, but what does it mean to be embodied in some expectation?
Yeah, and so from the research that I did, looking at how women felt limited by this intensive motherhood, I was really surprised when the women in this BIPOC project, they really were doing all these things. Like, they knew all the information. They were, meeting the needs of their baby above their own. Like, they just were this sort of like really this mother goddess, mother
that seems
lion,
to
bear.
Contradict the whole cultural, the media depiction of welfare mothers and out not taking care. What you're saying, it seems to be the opposite of what we've been conditioned to believe.
Absolutely, and I think one of the keys to this was the support that women sort of enlisted. So having a supportive husband or partner, hiring, again, that emotional support doula to translate any medical information and to help them make decisions, sort of checks and balances, choosing a care provider that was a person of color, and then also...
How easy is that? To find a care provider that's a person of color?
Hard, yeah. And some women were not able to. So again, I think that
Which
the women...
isn't to impugn, a white doctor that's cognizant of the discrepancies in how we talk to each other and cultural backgrounds and stuff. But.
Yeah, and some of the women in the study had to travel far, to find a provider that met their needs. And another interesting thing about this was, again, so in these podcast episodes, it was sort of like, let me tell you all the things that you can do to make your experience better. And so they would share, like, there's free doula programs in Minneapolis called Roots, or all these different things where it's like, here, take this information and employ it. Like, this will help you. And again, not all women were able to have a person of color as a provider, but if they weren't able to, these women expected a lot of their partners to be well-versed in the birth process, well-versed with the culture of birth, and it was just really amazing, because it really shows that the value of community, and when people sort of rally around a mom who's about to have a baby, that the outcomes can be so much better, and she feels so much more supported.
Why is that? I mean, partly it's got to be communication, but
absolutely,
partly it also has to be the actual physical presence and the actual physical support. So what component of that would be communication? And this is one of the things that you're interested in, the interpersonal and relationship communication. So one of the things you said was it takes a village, or a village. Mm-hmm. Village is essential for a healthy pregnancy. So how does that translate into both communication and the actual physical practices that might be there?
And I think the key to sort of all of these things is the ethic of care. So really being empathetic, open, a good listener, caring. I think that all of those things were the key. And so when the mother expected those things from her care provider, from her partner, from her family, her friends, that led to better outcomes. And when it wasn't sort of sheltered, that like, oh no, I can just do this all by myself, because again, in my dissertation research, it's like, well, I have to be this intensive mother, but I can't do it all on my own. But these women of color were able to really kick butt and really, again, like be this mama tiger, because they had all of this support, and they expected a lot from their loved ones, and their loved ones showed up for them, which I think is really beautiful. You
mentioned that part of this study was during COVID, so I'm assuming that there's both good and bad experiences, because we had to be alone and we couldn't go. Maybe you can just summarize a couple of those points.
Yeah, and so there's two main findings from the sort of impact that COVID-19 had on the birth experience for these women, and the positives were that women were able to sort of slow down. So a lot of times their partners, family members were working from home, or they just were more accessible. So the pregnant moms were able to stay home, relax. They didn't have to go to, their niece or nephew's birthday party if they didn't want, or, they could just sort of really relax and focus on themselves. And again, on that sort of work on what they wanted for their birth, what they expected communicatively from their care providers, things like that. But then the negative was, again, though, because due to isolation, that maybe they weren't able to go to some prenatal yoga, or they weren't able to see their friends as often as they would have liked.
The community they might have wanted wasn't really allowed, or
in some sense, or like their circle was smaller. Or they had some anxiety surrounding it. So it's like, well, is it safe to have, my friend come over? And so again, it's experiences that we've all had in the last couple of years, right? But I thought it was really interesting that it was sort of restorative to relax and take it easy and focus on. It gave them the opportunity to ask more of their partners, do more work towards getting ready for birth than maybe they would have otherwise.
Sometimes the things that you focus on when there's a crisis like COVID or a war or something provides you with information that you hadn't expected. Like, also less travel meant that there was less pollution, and it kind of changed how much oil energy and on renewable resources were used. Those all declined as well, which is an indication both take more time for yourself, for your baby, for your birth. Maybe we shouldn't be traveling as much using the kind of transportation that we have, and that's kind of an unexpected outcome from the conditions that we weren't all excited about to enter into. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I want to thank you. As I said, the time goes quickly, so Dr. Valerie Cronin-Fisher, it's all the time we have, I'm sorry. My name's Lee Artz, and I'll see you next time.